couple more questions in the chat. One from Jane. Before we move on, can we include as match dollars spent on capital projects that occurred during this biennium that are not part of the contracted project? No. Hopefully, well, I'm 1 minute early, so I'll wait till the clock strikes 10:45 to answer that. Okay, so Jane, hopefully you're back on the line. Essentially, you cannot count any match dollars that are not recorded in the contract as part of this project. So every dollar that's going to be counted as match or as a reimbursable expense needs to be noted in your contract. You can't just pull other random funds. If there needs to be an adjustment to your budget and the dollars that you're claiming as match, we can do an amendment in the future if there's some other expense that comes up. But we really do want to stick with, as closely as possible, with the scope of work that was reviewed by the panel. So we can talk offline more specifically about your project and see see what flexibility there is there, but ultimately what was reviewed by the panel, we really want to try to stick as closely to that as possible. Okay. Question, some folks are sending me direct messages. I'll just go ahead and answer those. Lynn asks, will we need to have redeemed our pledges in order to sign the contract? Which I think you mean is pledged donation dollars. No, I don't believe so. David, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that one. Just knowing that those funds are committed by whomever is planning to donate is sufficient to get the contract signed.
That's right. Some things are pledged that can't be provided before contracting. So
yeah, that's fine. Great question. All right, moving into contract overview. To basically review the Washington State's purpose in this contract. So a contract is an agreement between the state and your organization, and you're each getting benefits from it. So you are getting the benefit of the grant dollars, and the state is getting the benefit of or preserving and interpreting Washington's history and heritage and providing that public access to history. So as a state agency, we are here to serve the citizens of Washington State. So we want to be responsible with the public resources that are through this program, public dollars from citizens of Washington State. So that is something that we are concerned about as your partner in this contracting. So this looks a little overwhelming. We're going to talk through each of these attachments quickly, but you will need to be sure to thoroughly read the contract, not only you as the project manager or project contact, but your governing body as well. So while we will review some key points that we want to call out today, you really do need to be sure to thoroughly review the contract because it is a binding legal document. First, that contract form kind of sets out the framework of the agreement, the contracting parties, who and what you're doing, how much can be reimbursed, which minus the admin fee. So it shows you the exact dollar amount that you can expect to be reimbursed. It lays out both the period of performance and the length of the contract, which are two different things. So the period of performance is the time in which you are performing the work of the contract, but the length of the contract will extends to 13 years after project completion, that monitoring period that you all hopefully were aware of in the guidelines. So that is something important to be aware of, that you are entering into a contract of 15 years probably after all is said and done, of the 2 years of implementation and the 13 years of monitoring. So it also identifies 2 key people: the contract signatory, who is the one who is legally authorized. And this needs to be your mayor, or the head of your elected governing body, such as your board. Or if it's not one of those 2 people, it's someone who has been given that authority through an official passed, voted on and signed resolution of the board or of the city. So it does really need to be someone with that legal authority. It can't just be a staff person, unless it is someone like an executive director who's been given that responsibility through an action of the board. And then it also identifies the contract representative. Sometimes that can be the same person, usually for smaller projects that happens more often. But there does need to be only one contract representative that we are regularly communicating with. So in the history of this program, well, and really in grant management I've done in my past too, it really does help to have just one central contact for us to be sending updates to, report requests to, and that one person can certainly send out that information to other people on the team that need to have it. For instance, if your treasurer is going to be the one putting together the reimbursement report, that's fine. You can delegate that responsibility to another person. But we as Heritage Capital Project staff need to have that one representative that we are communicating with, that knows what's going on in the project and that can get the information to the right people on your team. So that is also the person who will be listed as your primary contact in the Heritage portal. So it is important to keep that person updated and let us know if that person ever changes. We certainly understand over the period of 15 years that can change. So just keep us updated and let us know. So attachment A is the long one, and these are the headings that that are in it. So I'm going to open actually a Word document here. David, can you all see the Word document?
Yes, I.
Great. Okay. So as I mentioned, you will all need to be sure to read this yourself and thoroughly, but we are going to hit a couple of highlighted points here today. At the top of all the pages of your contract will be your contract number, which we will get to you. And I actually was going to put a slide up in the presentation and I forgot, but it is basically the number 23 -0102 based on where you fell in the ranking from the panels. So we've published a list on our website. I can send that all out to you, and those will be your contract numbers. So please refer to that number in all communications so that we can make sure to file and document everything correctly. In this headings and definitions section, I already spoke about these 2 things, but again, it is important to have a legally authorized person signing your contract and all contract amendments if they're needed, and then a representative who's the person that we are coordinating with on sort of the day-to-day project issues, reports, and project management. Real property value, fair market value of a property, if you're using property acquisition or as a in-kind donation, this does need to be determined by a qualified professional appraiser. You can't just say, well, I donated this property and I think it's worth $100,000, or I bought it for such and such 10 years ago, or whatever. It does need to be an official appraisal. So if that is part of your project, let us know. And we can get you more information about that if you need. Order of precedence. If there is any inconsistency, this is the order of sort of the documentation and laws and rules that we are going to follow if there's any inconsistencies or questions into the future. Contract modifications. So we try to make contract modifications as easy as possible if they're needed. It comes up fairly often if you know a scope is being changed or you know, a budget is being changed slightly. Again, not so much that it would change the intention of the project that was approved by the panel, or if there's an extension needed. We basically will draft up an amendment that lists what in the contract is changing. Both parties sign it, and that modifies the contract. So if you need to do that, we will walk you through that when it is needed. Non-assignability. This refers to the fact that we are contracting with your organization only. And if you are, you know, contracting with other organizations to operate your building or do parts of your project, you are still legally held responsible for what is in your contract and for the 13-year monitoring period after. So it means that if you hire or partner with someone to fulfill some of the requirements of your contract, that's fine, that you can do that, but you are still going to be held responsible for that work being completed and that work meeting the terms of the contract. Acknowledgements. Hopefully you all know about this from the guidelines. We would like to see acknowledgement during the construction process. This can be something fairly informal, like a banner or some other sign that just lets people know that the state of Washington is investing funding in your project, and we'd love to see that up during the project. And then we also require a permanent acknowledgement of some sort after the project is complete. So we don't have a specified direction on this because, especially with a permanent acknowledgement, a lot of people have different ways of acknowledging you know, benefactors and donors to projects, whether it's a donor wall or, you know, donor bricks or something like that. We actually just had a project ask us if they could put our name on an engraved silver platter, which will be displayed on their property, which we thought was really creative and very cool. So everyone is going to be doing it a little bit differently, and that's fine. If you need suggestions on language or logo, we can definitely help you with that. We just don't make a specific requirement of what that needs to look like, but we're happy to help if you want some guidance. And then especially for the permanent acknowledgement, we'll need to see evidence of that at the end of your project. Evaluation and monitoring. So in addition to reports and things filed during your project about the progress, we will be potentially, hopefully, making site visits again, and we'll be monitoring your project into the future as well. So that is something we want to do through the Heritage Portal. We are setting up an annual monitoring form through the portal. So we'll send you an email once a year saying, hey, it's been a year, let us know how you're continuing to meet your project purpose and what we agreed to in the contract into the future. It does say periodic site inspections here. We'll try to give you as much heads up as we can when we visit. We certainly aren't trying to surprise anybody, but there are some occasions where if we're traveling around the state and we're close by, we may want to try to pop in and see you or see the project. So again, we'll try to give you as much notice as possible, but depending on travel schedules, we may just pop in. There is language in here about dispute resolution, and of course we hope that we won't have disputes with anyone, but you do have rights, and so this is outlined here, so definitely be sure to read the whole section. But basically it talks about how there will be a third party moderator to help with that, so that there is a sort of neutral party also participating in any dispute resolution that is needed. There is information in here about suspension for cause. So if there is any way that you are, or termination for cause rather, if you are not in compliance with the terms of the contract, that is reason, that is cause for termination. If corrective action is needed, we do have a 30-day period to try to help you get back into compliance with the contract. And if you're not able to be in compliance by then, we can terminate the contract, which means that you would have to basically give back the grant dollars plus interest. The program has never had to do this. We certainly hope never to have to do this, but it is in there in the contract that you sign. So good to be aware of and to read through. Okay. All right, back to the slides. The next attachment is going to be the scope of work. And this is going to be a little bit different from anyone who's had a grant from us before. It starts with a narrative, which is a general description. And then instead of breaking everything out by architectural divisions, which is what you did in your application, we are going to organize it by what we're calling elements of work. So instead of breaking it into material sections, we're going to basically break it into practical elements or phases that correspond to the order you're doing the work. So, if you're installing HVAC and then you move to replacing your roof or replacing some windows and doors or something like that, those items are grouped together as pieces of work you're doing rather than spreading out the materials or spreading out the phases or elements of the work amongst all of the material divisions. So what this means is it will take some time for us to basically translate what you have in your application under the materials divisions and group them by elements of work. Hopefully the scope of work narrative you provided is clear enough that we'll be able to pull out those elements, those broad sort of elements or phases easily, and then add those specific materials and detail into those. But this may take a little bit of extra time this time around. We do still want materials and methods to be described in detail, oops, apologies, under those elements. So it's not, we still want a good amount of detail in this section. We're just organizing that information a little bit differently. Project purpose. So this is attachment C, and this is basically what is monitored in the long term. So we're going to be looking through your application and the argument that you made to the panel as to why you should be funded. We're going to distill that down as much as possible into something very basic that I think for a lot of you will probably be met by continuing to fulfill your mission. And then of course, any other additional activities that you're committing to in the course of this project. But there's some sample text on the screen here. So you can see it's very basic to provide public access to history through activities, tours, exhibits, and then also follow best practices, field best practices here. So this can apply to whatever field is applicable for your organization. If you are doing a historic rehabilitation, you want to follow those standards that I talked about earlier. If you're doing exhibits, artifacts, collection or management, or collections management, archaeology, there are organizations and state agencies that do this all for a living. And so you need to be sure that you're consulting with the appropriate folks and getting the best information, best practices for the work that you're doing. We don't expect you to be perfect, but we do expect that you are consulting with the right folks who know what they're doing and doing your best to follow those best practices. And we've got exhibits and collections folks on staff at the Historical Society. So we've got folks who can help guide you in those too. There's also WAMA, the Washington Museum Association. There's lots of great resources out there. So if you need assistance finding those, let us know. All right. Attachment D is your project budget, and this again is going to look a little different for any returning grantees. We have reduced the cost categories even further. They've been reduced in the past, and we're reducing them again, mainly because we have found that we don't do a lot of specific reporting or documentation of things by cost category or report out. We generally report out larger numbers or higher level numbers, to the public, to our auditors, all those sorts of things. And so we really distilled it down into the three main types of costs. Most of you are going to be almost all within the construction or rehabilitation. So whether that's a new building or rehabbing an old one, that's probably where most of your costs are going to be. If you have architecture, engineering, any other pre-construction or design activities, that'll be under this. And then of course, property acquisition is kind of its own thing, which applies to some projects, but not a huge percentage usually. So again, we'll need to be sort of translating what was in your application and combining some of those budget proposal items. I don't think that'll be super difficult, but that will take a little bit of reorganizing, which we'll definitely want you to be reviewing when we do send you your draft of your contract. Attachment E is the source of available funds. So this has, as I understand, have been confusing for some folks in the past. So let us know if you need assistance with this. This basically demonstrates that you have the funds sufficient to complete the project. We want information about where the funds came from, not just what your bank balance is right now. So did you get a grant? Is that where a chunk of your money is coming from? Do you have some major donors that are giving you money? And this is because for organizations that pursue multiple avenues of funding, particularly public dollars, state-funded dollars, you are not allowed to count match twice. You can't match some donor dollars to our grant and then go ahead and match donor dollars to a commerce grant. Those donor dollars can only count one time, or your city or county grant can only count as match one time against state funding. So this is helpful information for us and other state grant applications may want to see this as well. What specific items are you using as match for your Heritage Capital projects? So membership dues, grants, donations, any of that, we want to see the specific source of where the funds came from. And as I mentioned before, we do need to see documentation of all of this before we can proceed with your contract. All right. Attachment F is agreeing to follow the law, which hopefully won't be a surprise to anyone. These are the ones that are called out in the contract. We've talked a bit about the 2102, but all of these other ones are applicable as well. As I mentioned, we are not a regulatory agency, so we are not going to be following up with you and asking for documentation about all of these things, because you need to be working with the state agencies that do regulate these things in order to make sure that you are following the laws required in order to use this public money. So the one that folks have a lot of questions about often is prevailing wage. This is something that you need to contact the Department of Labor and Industries about. You are considered the awarding agency. That's the term that they use. You will be needing to provide intent and affidavit forms for contractors and subcontractors for your project. So this is not something you provide to us. This is something that you work directly with L&I about, but it is something that you do need to do before we contract with you. And it's also, you must submit certified payroll records as well down here in this other bullet. Typically, that's work that your contractor does, but it is something that you as the grantee, as the signer of the contract, needs to sort of confirm is happening and that those laws are being followed. These are contacts at the Department of Labor and Industries that you can get more information from. Both of these folks are specifically work with prevailing wage regulations. So we unfortunately don't have a lot of information beyond what was on that last slide. And these are the folks that you really need to get in touch with to get more questions answered and to make sure that you're following those particular laws. Moving right along, attachment Z, property parcel numbers and legal descriptions. So this is basically a description of the property that the contract applies to. If you have a large property with multiple parcel numbers, we only really need to attach the contract to the parcel where the funding is, going to capital improvements, because the terms of the contract will apply to all property that is listed here in this attachment. So if you at some point in the future want to sell off a parcel, you don't necessarily want it restricted by this contract if it didn't receive any of the capital improvements that the funding went toward. So if that's an issue, we definitely we can walk you through that. We can talk more about that if you have a question. I don't think a lot of folks will have huge properties, but that's something to be aware of. And then, of course, if it's something other than a building, then we will, it seems to be here for vessel or other assets, we can get some additional information that will help clarify and legally describe that asset. Attachment 8 is leases, contracts, and agreements. And David mentioned this a little bit earlier about we need to know any leases or subleases that you have entered into, whether it's you leasing the property or you owning the property and leasing it to others. Basically, we need to know any legal agreements that you have that would affect the, as you can see down here, that would affect the use, access, or control of the property. So because we are requiring you to provide public access to history, we need to know if there's any potential legal obligations that you have that could affect that. So any existing ones right now, we need to know of in the contract and have that recorded. And also, if you are entering into any in the future, throughout the period of that 13-year monitoring period, we need to know before you sign any type of legal agreement that affects the access to your property. We need to know first because you have a contract with us. So typically, this is not a thing that we have an issue with. We just need to know about it before you do it to make sure it's not going to interfere with the terms of the contract that you have with us. Okay, so moving forward, just to sort of sum up some big points from this last section, keep your contract number in all communications. We need to designate a project contract lead, which will be your primary contact in the Heritage Portal. You need to send us proof of consultation with DAP. We need to see 100% of your mats before we can contract. And then you need to determine prevailing wage requirements. And also I've thrown here high performance building requirements, which was on that other slide that I didn't mention previously. This is through Department of Enterprise Services and typically applies to buildings of very large square footage. So probably won't apply to many of you, but definitely something to inquire about to make sure whether or not it does. Okay, we've got another scheduled 5-minute break. That was a lot to get through. I see that David is answering questions in the chat. So anything we need to ask out loud, David, or do you have it all covered in there? We can save the chat as well and post that afterward. So it looks like he's been answering everything.
Yeah, there's a couple really specific situations, and the rest of them were either easy answers or we're going to cover shortly. So. Great. There's a couple here now, though. How do we send proof of TAP consultation? They'll provide you a letter. Yes. That says, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, so they will say that they've consulted a letter that they've consulted with you, that you have, there is either no adverse effect to historic properties, or that if there is an adverse effect that you've taken measures to what's called mitigate that. For any projects that involve historic properties, hopefully it's not an issue of resolving adverse effects. It's an issue of them reviewing the work you're proposing so that you follow the historic preservation standards. And so they say, oh, there's no adverse effect because you're following the standards and you're doing it right. So all the work you're doing is affecting the property positively instead of negatively or adversely. So like I said earlier, the informal versus formal consultation, the sort of ending of that formal consultation is the letter, or not ending, but like acknowledgement, I guess, is that official letter that they send you. It's all the written stuff back and forth. But as I did say before, you do want to continue to be in communication with DAP if there are any changes to your scope or proposed work on historic structures, so that you're just transparent with them and you're not trying to do work that they're not aware of. They're very helpful folks, and it's good just to keep that line of communication open and let them know if there are any changes.
I have a question. Can I ask clarifying questions, Claire?
Sure.
Thanks. So Claire with Metro Parks Tacoma. To document that we did our consultation with DAP, we need to forward you that letter in like an email, or is there a way to submit it on the portal?
Great question. So at this point, unfortunately, we're going to have to default to email. So yeah, go ahead and send that to us. We are trying, this is one of those technical things about the portal that we're trying to get up and running, but unfortunately, I don't think we have the capacity to add attachments right now to the existing request record. So if that changes, I'll let you all know, but just for now, great question. We'll just stick with email to avoid confusion with the technical stuff, but hopefully in the future, other documentation will all be able to be submitted in the portal.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's see. Roof replacement needs to be done in the summer and fall. Are you back and forth with these folks in the chat, David, or do we need to?
No, so I've left them since we're answering these. There's a couple. There's a prevailing wage question and the roof replacement that you were starting there. So
got it.
Yeah, as far as prevailing wage, the full scope of the project is something that we can break into portions of the overall project.
That's something that you'll want to look at in the way that you define your project. What we recommend is doing phases, so that you can break it into meaningful phases to limit the scope of work to what you really need for the grant without being, for lack of a better word, dishonest about what the project really is. For example, the roof replacement. I know this project. It's a very large facility, and they're doing the roof replacement over a period of several years and biennia. And so each phase is a couple of years apart, and they're doing sections of the building. And that's one way that they're able to phase it, so that you don't have a $20 million project that the HCP portion of the project or the phase is maybe $1 million, and you don't want to have to incur prevailing wages on the rest of the project. I think is probably what the intent here is. And so that's what I guess what I'm getting at is you'll want to make your phases make sense both financially and from a construction standpoint. So if you can phase it that way, you can kind of I'm not trying to advise you to skirt the law, or pay people non-living wages, but you can structure the projects, I guess, so that you can minimize the impact of those prevailing wages. But as with any question about prevailing wages, the answer ultimately is consult with L&I.
Yep.
As far as mitigating the time compression aspects, the contracting procedure, that if you need to get your contract completed and executed right away, let us know, and we can work on those first, as opposed to somebody who's not planning to start till maybe in the winter. And we can do that. The biggest thing though is to have all your documentation handy and organized, so that when we ask for it for the contract, it's ready.